right. So we were talking about chemical bonds and we ended sort of on hydrophobic interactions here. I was talking about how certain molecules that are hydrophobic do not interact with water. So oil and water don't mix. That's the best example of a hydrophobic interaction. And that does happen in our cells. So we'll get into that, like I said, with the cell membrane when we get into the cell chapter. I'm actually going to skip over a few things here. So that's good news for you, probably. Don't worry about this. So from this slide, it was just going to be more of an in-class activity again. For the take home for this slide, what you want to know is a water molecule has 2 covalent bonds. So the answer to that question, how many covalent bonds are in a water molecule, that's 2. So if you look at a water molecule, I'm going to go on to the next slide here. I'll show you where they are. And I'll start the slideshow in just a second. So there is 1 covalent bond between each hydrogen and the oxygen. So these 2 arrows here are basically indicating the covalent bond. So within 1 water molecule, this is 1 water molecule, there are 2 covalent bonds. The next point that I'm not going to belabor, but I ask here, how many hydrogen bonds can 1 water molecule form with others? I'm going to go to the next slide for that and give you the answer. If you're interested in how this works, please feel free to ask me, but I'm just going to give you the answer and just kind of just remember this basically. If this diagram, I know it looks kind of crazy and scary, but it's describing this process of how many hydrogen bonds, how many water molecules 1 water molecule can bond with. So how many outside bonds it can have. And the answer to that is 4. And I actually have that down here in the notes section, which I think you can see. So I kind of wrote that out for you. But the answer to that question is 4 bonds. So you can have 4 external water molecule bonds. So you have the central one. It can attach to 1, 2, 3, 4 other water molecules. That creates this whole lattice of water molecules, which we'll talk about in just a second. That's going to be really important. Okay. So sorry to rush through that, but rather than, like I said, going into extreme detail about how that works, it's just hydrogen bonding between the different water molecules. The really important part is what I'm about to get into, the emergent properties of water. So the cool things that water can actually do because of this, mainly because of the hydrogen bonding. Okay. So now I'll go ahead and start the slideshow. What properties emerge in water molecules? So you kind of know the overall structure of a water molecule. When they all come together, they have some properties that individual water molecules don't have. So I'm going to go through each of these really important properties. They're important from a life perspective. So water is needed for life. When water is found on some other planet, like when they found evidence of water on Mars, it was a huge deal because we need water for, as far as how we understand life, we need water to survive. And these properties of water allow water to basically help us and provide that life-sustaining substance. So first of all, it's really important that ice floats on liquid water. So usually when you think of a solid, if you think of different states of substances, solid, liquid, gas, you think of solid as the most dense, and you would expect something more dense to sink, which it does in liquid typically. However, the solid form of water, ice, actually expands and becomes less dense. It expands, so that means it's going to float on top of liquid water. So if you've ever seen a pond freeze over in the winter, the ice is on the top and underneath it's still liquid water. It doesn't freeze from the bottom up to where you have one solid block of ice. That's really important, for example, for these little shrimpy guys or any fish that are living under the water. It helps insulate their water and their habitat, and it basically doesn't solidify their entire habitat. It's not completely solidified. So that expansion of water, the reason for that, won't get into too much detail, but these hydrogen bonds between all these water molecules that I just talked about, so here you see that, in liquid water, they're sort of constantly breaking and reforming, which keeps the water molecules closer together. It doesn't allow them to spread out as much. When it freezes, those hydrogen bonds kind of, they stay static. They don't break and reform and break and reform. So they stay static, and then the water molecules actually spread out from each other a little bit. And then that makes the ice less dense, so it floats on top of the liquid, which is backwards compared to most substances. Don't worry about that last bullet point. Yeah, I don't really have time to go into that, but an interesting factoid, water's not the densest, like right at freezing or above freezing, which is 0 degrees Celsius. It's actually most dense at 4 degrees Celsius. But we're not going to worry about that right now. The take-home message is that the solid form of water floats on top of the liquid form. Another critically important property of water is that it allows for temperature moderation. This can be within an organism or the climate as a whole. So what this means is that water can absorb and release a lot of heat or energy without really changing temperature. So usually if you think of metal, when it absorbs heat, it gets really hot and it changes temperature quickly. Water is the opposite. It can absorb a lot of heat, but not actually change temperature. So for instance, since we are about 75% water, we can absorb and release a lot of heat, but our core temperature stays about the same, which is a good thing. If you think about it from a climate perspective, the oceans and other large bodies of water are absorbing and releasing heat without changing temperature a bunch. So if the ocean absorbed a lot of heat and increased in temperature significantly, the organisms within it would die because they need a very stable temperature. So that temperature moderation allows for stability within an organism or the climate as a whole. I've defined specific heat here as well. Specific heat is just the amount of heat that's needed to change the temperature of whatever substance you're talking about. Here we'll just say water, 1 degree Celsius. So how much heat can something take on before it changes the temperature by 1 degree Celsius? Based on that definition, we can say that water has a really high specific heat. It takes a lot of heat to raise the temperature of water 1 degree Celsius. So it has a high specific heat. And this is why, if you think of, if you've ever heard the terms continental climate versus maritime climate. So a continental climate is a climate like in the interior of a continent. So you can think Kansas or Oklahoma versus maritime, which would be maybe, you know, the coast of Georgia, South Carolina, near an ocean. The maritime climate, any like cities or land area next to an ocean, the temperature does not fluctuate nearly as much, even if it's on the same latitude. It stays a lot more constant than, say, Kansas or Oklahoma, which it gets, the continental climate areas get very hot in the summer and very cold in the winter. If you're, say, in Charleston or Savannah, it's a slightly different latitude, but they stay fairly temperate year round. So that's all due to the temperature moderation provided by water in the ocean. Another aspect of temperature moderation, so this is just the same definition that I gave on the previous slide for temperature moderation. Heat of vaporization. So this has to do with how much heat a liquid, so in this case we'll say water, how much heat water needs to absorb until it can evaporate, essentially, be converted to gas. So from moving from water, liquid water, to steam, water, again, because it is really good at moderating temperature, has a really high heat of vaporization. It takes a lot of energy and heat to make water go from liquid to gas. It does not easily vaporize into the gas steam form. So a lot of this is to say water it keeps our bodies, other animals' bodies, our climate very stable. Without it, there would be far more fluctuation. And this final point down here that I have on the slide about evaporative cooling is important from a survival kind of homeostasis standpoint. And this is it's basically sweating. So sweating cools us down. As a liquid evaporates, the surface from which that liquid is evaporating, in this case water, is going to cool down. So water will take that heat with it as it vaporizes. So if you imagine yourself sweating, water is coming out of your pores and it has a good amount of heat with it. So when it vaporizes off of your skin, it's taking that heat with it and away from your body to allow you to cool down. So that is evaporative cooling. All right, on to the next few properties here. First, we have something called cohesion between water molecules. This just means that water molecules are attracted to each other. They want to stick to each other. That's cohesion. And I already sort of talked about why that is with the hydrogen bonds between them. So they're polar, which means they have slight charges. So each water molecule has a slight charge. So the negative part and the positive part of two different water molecules are going to be attracted to each other, holding them together. This creates something called surface tension. And surface tension is what allows, well, this mosquito, for instance, or if you've ever seen water striders walking around on the top of a pond or a stream, that's what allows for those insects to stay on top of the water rather than falling through, because normally they would fall through without surface tension. This results at like I said, the boundary of air and water. So where you have, we'll say, the upper surface of a pond meeting the air, that's where you get the surface tension. It's at the surface and it's tense water. So surface tension. And the reason for that, excuse me, the reason for that is because of this cohesion. So I'm going to explain this diagram here on the bottom right. So hang on. So all of this, these are all individual water molecules that we have here. We'll imagine this is the surface of the water. And then down here, we have, let's look at this water molecule right here, kind of in the middle. Oh my gosh, hang on. Okay, you guys don't need to hear me coughing. So this water molecule, remember, one water molecule can attach to 4 others around it, right? So that's what we see here. We have one water molecule. Actually, let me draw on here. This might help. So one water molecule right here attached to 1, 2, 3, 4. So those are all being held together. That makes perfect sense. So then what happens at the top? So the surface, there's no water above here, right? So you guys can probably see already that So this water molecule can still wants to be attracted to sort of 4 different water molecules. It has one here, and one here, but there's not one above it. So it's actually kind of doubly attracted to the other water molecules next to it. So that's what creates the surface tension. Those 2 arrows are indicating that there's a really strong connection between this water molecule on all the water molecules on the surface, basically. So that allows for the surface tension that we see. Okay. So that's cohesion. Something that sounds similar, and you'll go over this in lab too, actually. This will be a little ways down into the semester, but you'll talk about cohesion and adhesion. Adhesion is where water molecules are attracted to other substances other than itself, and these substances have to be polar. So likes are attracted to likes, which means that polar substances are attracted to polar substances. So water is not attracted to oil, for instance, like I just said. So it has to be something else that's polar, which a lot of things are polar. So these needles on this tree are polar. They have a charge. So you can see the water molecule is sticking to it, right? It's not falling off of it. So that's adhesion. Water attracted to other polar substances is adhesion. And then if we combine those 2, you get a whole new property. So when you combine cohesion and adhesion, you get something called capillary action. So capillary action basically uses both cohesion and adhesion to move water, usually against the flow of the force of gravity is how we think of it. So water, if you imagine this tree, plants get water from their roots, right? But the water has to make its way all the way up into the tree, or even if it's a small plant, all the way up the plant, against the force of gravity. There's no like heart pumping it like we have, pumping our blood. So just the simple fact that water is attracted to itself, as well as the little tubes basically within the plant, will allow that water to rise up against gravity and make its way all the way up into the tree. So that's capillary action. Let me go over here. So the adhesion is the water molecule, which is this little guy here, being attracted to the cell wall. So we're talking about specific cells that pull water up or allow water movement within a plant. And then in addition to that water molecule being attracted to the cell wall of the plant, these water molecules are also attracted to each other. So it ends up pulling the water up through what we call xylem. You don't have to worry about that, but xylem is the structure that allows water to move through a plant. So by being attracted to both the wall as well as the other water molecules, that sort of pulls the water up into higher reaches of the plant. So that is capillary action. And if you've ever, I think I have this at the end of the lecture, but we're not really going to have a ton of time to do practice with it. But if you ever dip like the corner of a paper towel into water and you see the water kind of climbing up the paper towel, that's capillary action. So the water is moving against the force of gravity. Okay, capillary action. And then finally, our last property is just that water is a very powerful solvent. You'll hear it called the universal solvent a lot of times. And a solvent is just a substance that dissolves other things. So water can dissolve a lot of other types of molecules very well. This is because it relates back again to its polarity. So it being polar and having this positively charged side and a negatively charged side allows it to form hydrogen bonds pretty easily. So this water molecule can basically get into this, if you imagine this salt crystal, which we talked about NaCl as far as ionic bonds go in the last class. That water molecule will get into this salt crystal and then basically surround each of the negatively charged anions, the chlorines, and the positively charged cations. So like over here, because this side of the water molecule, the H's are positively charged, those will be attracted to the chlorines. The negatively charged oxygens will be attracted to the positively charged sodiums, and they surround those individual atoms in what's called a hydration shell. So this sphere of water around each of these ions is essentially the process of dissolving that salt by breaking up that salt crystal right here because of this attraction between the negative and positive charges. So take home message from this slide, water can dissolve a lot of stuff. If you've ever made a casserole and like left it the dish unwashed overnight, and then you just put some water in it and leave it for several hours, even if everything is like solidified on there, the water will break a lot of it down, which is pretty impressive. Not everything, but it'll do a pretty good job at most of it. Okay. So water is a powerful solvent. What time we got? What is it? Let's see. Where'd my time go? There we go. Okay. So I am going to leave these slides for you guys to practice with, again, in the interest of time. But I have the answers to each of these slides. So I just put some pictures up and asked what property of water these represent. So I'll run through them, but in the notes section at the bottom of my PowerPoint slides, you'll see the answers for each of these. So make sure you can identify these images based on the different properties of water. Some of them might have, you can apply more than one potentially. Okay, so there's the capillary action one. So yeah, if you've ever dipped the corner of a paper towel in any kind of liquid and it climbs up, that's capillary action. So that's the answer to that one. Okay. Now with acids and bases, I'm also going to tell you that you only need to know a very small portion of what I've put on these slides. So make note of this. What I really want you to understand with, I think most people have heard of pH. So it's just a measure of the acidity of a substance. So you have acids and you have bases. I don't really, I'm not going to ask you about any of the information that's on this slide about what an acid releases or a base accepts or releases. What I really want you to know is the pH scale. So for our purposes, because we don't have a ton of time to go over this information, this next slide, I think it's the next slide, is what I want you to focus on. Yeah, so the pH scale. So what I want you to know here, so just say for the pH stuff, slide 40, which it's numbered down here, slide 40 is what I want you to be familiar with. Not necessarily the different substances here, but just that 7 is neutral. So you want to know 7 is our neutral number for the pH scale. On the lower side of that, you have acids. Above that, you have bases. So anything below 7, anytime you have a number on the pH scale below 7, that's going to be an acid. You can see our stomachs are actually really, really acidic, like a little bit more acidic than lemons, which is pretty crazy. So the further down towards 0 you get, the more acidic it is. As you go to the other side of 7, so above neutral, you get more and more basic. So bleach is a base, ammonia, egg white. So just be able to tell me based on a pH value, whether it's acidic or basic. All you have to remember is that cutoff of 7. 7 is neutral, that's pure water. Anything below it is acidic, anything above it is basic. Okay, so that sort of cuts down on the info and the amount of info you need to know about this, but I think that's the most important part for this class, learning about the pH scale. So if you have kind of a handle on that, you'll use that a lot more and see it a lot more as you move on in life. If you're not dealing with this from a hardcore scientific perspective, you'll see the pH scale often enough. Okay. And then this you don't need to worry about. So I think I'm done with this PowerPoint. These questions to consider are just something to sort of think about. I might come back to these before the first exam, just for sort of a review. And then at the end here, I have just some bullet points to make sure you kind of grasp the main concepts of this lecture. Okay, any questions about that, about what you need to know and don't need to know? I know I cut a lot of that stuff out. Okay. So I added the next lecture, I think, let me check, to Canvas, getting into biological macromolecules. So now we're going to apply the chemistry, basically. Let me make sure I put this up here. Yes, so under the Unit 1 module at the bottom, depending on how you have it set up, you should see 4 carbohydrates and lipids. So we're going to get into, we'll probably just introduce the idea of what a biological macromolecule is, which is the beginning of this PowerPoint that I uploaded. And then get into some more detail on carbohydrates and lipids on Monday. So I will pull this up for you, but it is available on Canvas. All right. So some of that, most of that chemical information, I went over the bonding, etc. Like I said, it has a purpose. We're moving into more complicated types of molecules now. So those bonds and those bond types and how atoms react with each other are going to play a part in creating these macromolecules. And macromolecules, there's 4 main macromolecules that I'll mention in just a few minutes. And you'll be familiar with their overall structure as well as some examples of them. So we're slowly building up. We had atoms and then we talked about molecules. Now we're going to talk about macromolecules, and macro just means big. So what I'll talk about here, like I said, I'm going to introduce the idea and some of the background behind macromolecules first. So carbon is essential to macromolecules. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about carbon and how it bonds, and functional groups. And I'll talk about what those are. Do a little bit about general structures of all 4 groups of macromolecules. And then we probably won't get to the actual carbohydrates and lipids until Monday. But on Monday, we'll talk about carbohydrates and lipids as our first 2 macromolecule categories. Okay, so let's jump into carbon. Carbon is a very versatile atom. So if you remember back, carbon has 4 valence electrons, which means it needs 4 more to fill up its outermost shell to get to 8. So it can bond with up to 4 other atoms. So it can bond with relatively a lot of different atoms, which basically allows it to be sort of the backbone of these big molecules. So carbon is going to be the backbone of these large molecules that we're talking about. So if you look at these bonded molecules down here at the bottom, this is a very simple example of carbon bonding to 4 hydrogens, right? So each of those hydrogens is going to share one of its electrons with carbon, which means now carbon's happy and it has 8 electrons in its outermost shell. It can also look a little bit different. It doesn't have to be single bonds. And I know not everyone has had chemistry, but this is probably fairly understandable. So one of these lines means it's a single bond. 2 of these bonds means it's a double bond. And then 3 means a triple bond. So you don't really need to know what that means in detail, but this carbon atom still has 4 bonds because there's 3, essentially it's sharing most of its, so 3 of its electrons are on this side of it and it's sharing with nitrogen. So that makes it a triple bond. Its 4th electron, it's sharing with another carbon atom. So there's still 4 bonds. So you see 4 lines. They're just oriented differently than you see over here with a simple CH4 setup. You'll see, we won't really deal with this a whole lot, a triple bond. You'll see C double bonded to oxygen a lot. So this will come up in just a few slides, actually. So take home message, carbon is going to be the backbone because it is really versatile due to its ability to bond with 4 other atoms potentially. Okay. So now we're going to talk about functional groups. Functional groups are groups of atoms that are, it's a very specific group of atoms that are bonded to the carbon backbone of organic molecules. So if you imagine sort of a big line of carbons as a backbone of a big organic molecule, these functional groups are coming off of that. In functional groups, there's like I said, very specific atoms. So they each have names and you'll need to be familiar with each of these names and what makes them up. So let's look at them. We're going to look at them all at once. So there's 7 total that you'll want to be familiar with. And then on the next few slides, we'll look at them in a little bit more detail with some diagrams. So these functional groups are always the same. So if you have, a lot of times, I told you that C double bonded to O occurs often. That would be an example of a functional group where you see those same combos of atoms over and over again. So this first example I have here, the hydroxyl group, you will see this a ton. And that little line coming off just means it's bonded to the carbon backbone. So an OH group is coming off of the carbon backbone. So that's a functional group, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. So the name of that is hydroxyl. So it's an oxygen and a hydrogen. So the oxygen is bonded to the hydrogen. We just don't have a line in between it. That's number 1. Number 2 is going to be the one I just mentioned, the carbonyl group. That is where we have a C double bonded to an O. So when a carbon is double bonded to an oxygen, that's a carbonyl group. And then similar, but 1 letter difference is carboxyl. Carboxyl group is COOH, COO. It's sort of a carbonyl plus a hydroxyl, which make carboxyl, if you want to think of it that way. So COOH. So if you combine both of those, you get COOH for carboxyl. You'll see carboxyl quite a bit as well. Well, you'll see all of these, most of these a lot. That's why they're the important functional groups. There's a lot more beyond these, but these are the 7 that you'll see and hear a good bit in this class. All right, carboxyl, amino. Amino is super easy. It's the only one that has a nitrogen in it. And this will mostly be dealing with this when we talk about like amino acids and DNA. So NH2, that just means, yeah, nitrogen with 2 hydrogens coming off of it. That's amino. Sulfhydryl has sulfur, the S, with an H on it, a hydrogen. So sulfhydryl, that's a pretty simple one, SH. And then phosphate. You'll see phosphate a lot when we talk about a very specific molecule that is of interest in cells called ATP. Phosphate groups are 1 phosphorus and 4 oxygens. I hope I'm not going too slow for you guys. It's hard to tell if people are keeping up on Zoom, so I'm just going to err on the side of caution and kind of slow down a little bit here. And then finally, we have methyl, the methyl group, which is C, carbon bonded to 3 hydrogens. So these functional groups will create specific characteristics for the molecules that they're attached to, and it will also help you, they'll help you identify different types of molecules. So based on whether there's a methyl group or an amino group, you'll be able to tell what category a molecule may fall into. That probably doesn't make sense to you right now, but it will as we get a little bit further along. Those are our 7 important functional groups. I'm going to go through the next few slides sort of quickly, as long as you guys have those names and molecular formulas written down. I'll show you some images sort of what they look like rather than just the letters. So over these next slides, here first we have the hydroxyl group. Don't worry about, I just pulled this from the textbook, so don't worry about the information down here. It might add to your understanding of the functional group, but I'm not going to ask you the information that's on the bottom, like what the compound name is or what it's due to. I just want you to be able to, I thought this would be helpful to see how these functional groups look on the structure of a molecule. So here we would have the carbon backbone. It's only 2, but we'll call it a backbone. And then you have the hydroxyl group, that OH coming off of one end. So that's our functional group right there. That's our hydroxyl functional group. And actually over here, the one I just went over, methyl, C plus 3 H's, that's going to be a methyl group, but I have a slide for that later on. So that's what I'm talking about when I say you'll be able to identify functional groups on these different molecules. If you see an OH and I say, what functional group is this? You'll be able to say hydroxyl. Here's the carbonyl. So C double bonded to O is carbonyl. So when you see that C double bond O, it can be in the middle of a molecule as well. It doesn't have to be on the end, but it's coming off of that carbon backbone. So you can see that carbon backbone here. Or it can be off the end. So C double bonded to O. That is a carbonyl. It can have another H coming off of it, That's fine. It doesn't make this not a carbonyl group. Anytime you see a C double bond O, that's a carbonyl. Carboxyl, now with carboxyl. So this is kind of the trickier part. So we have the C double bond O. If you have an OH coming off the other side, that makes it carboxyl. So the only time where you see the C double bond O and it's not carbonyl is if you have the OH off the other side. Then it's carboxyl. So this, I think those two are probably two of the toughest ones to sort of pick out. Don't worry about this over here. Let's just cross that out. That's confusing. Ignore that. So right here, we have the C double bonded to O and then an OH off the other side. That makes it carboxyl. And again, you can think of that as a carbonyl. Where's my mouse? Come on. I have lost my mouse. Okay. Anyway, you can see the C double bond O with the OH. It's a carbonyl plus a hydroxyl, which makes it the carboxyl specifically. Man, I have completely lost my mouse on my screen. Sorry if you guys are seeing a bunch of it. All right, let's see if I can move on. No, great. Oh, come on. All right, my computer is totally frozen. Oh my gosh, what do I do? Great. Okay, there we go. Sorry. Technical difficulties. So we'll stop there and I'll pick up with the rest of the functional groups on Monday. Don't forget to take the quiz today, and I'll see you guys Monday. I'll email you as to how we're meeting, in person or the split again, or yeah, all Zoom, whichever. Okay. Have a good weekend. Sorry for the technical difficulties, and I'll see you guys in one form or another on Monday.